All right, we'll go ahead and start. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who are here, my name is Eddie Chavez Calderon. I'm here with some great friends joining us today for this great event. My colleague AJ Frost from Arizona Juice for Justice is also here. And then we have our great friend Henry Barajas, who's here joining us to talk about his amazing comic book that is just fire. That I definitely recommend every single one of you to check it out. It's called La Voz del Mayo Tata Rambo, which is just a fire, like amazing, impactful title. So we're so happy to have you here, Henry. Just to start us off, I don't know, AJ, if you want to do a personal introduction of Henry, since I know y'all have a close relationship.
Yeah. Well, Henry, I would see Henry a lot at the various Comic Cons, and we both. Henry used to write for the Comics Beat, which I write for now, and Henry, you're from Tucson,
Born and
and
raised, yeah.
born and raised, and you were a journalist. Now you're over at Top Cow Comics, which is part of Image in Los Angeles, and this was your first book. I know, and I love that it's been. I saw it was featured like at the Smithsonian, libraries around the country. Now you're kickstarting your next book, and I think this is just an amazing journey you've been on, and I'm just so happy to talk to you today
Yeah,
about
thanks for
about
having me. Good to
about
meet
this
you,
book.
Eddie. Yeah, and everyone on the call. Thanks for hopping on.
So, Eddie, you want to start it off? Or you want me to start with the first question?
I guess Henry, like we really want to just start off with like talking about your background, and then like what's the purpose of the book, man? Why'd you write it, and kind of tell us a little bit. What does it mean to you?
So my name's Henry Barajas. I'm, like you said, from Tucson, Arizona, born and raised. My father came here as an undocumented person. His mother. It's funny because when I was a kid, we would always know about people crossing the border, and I was like, we were watching TV, and early 90s, I turned to my dad. I'm like, Dad, what was it like to cross the border? And he was like, we flew, like back in the day, it was a little easier to get here. And he so I always had this part of me in my life, within my father's side, from a lot of them from Juarez. And we lived with a family that could have been gone any day, and that was always a real fear. And sometimes some of my family members, mostly my uncles, would go to jail and then end up being deported back, and we'd have to go pick them up at the border, or my uncle would. And so yeah, it's something that I've always lived with, and something I've always wanted to talk about, being a Mexican American, having the privilege of being born in the United States, and having the skin and heritage of someone from south of the border. And my mom, her family is predominantly Native American, but also Mexican, because they skirt that line on the border with the Yoeme and the Basco Yaqui tribe. And my great grandmother was a Basco Yaqui woman, beautiful, amazing person. And my great grandfather, who was a Mexican American, his family from Mexico, he was born in Tucson, so he also shared that kind of duality that I live with. And all my life, my family would tell me that my great grandfather Ramon Jauregue was this great man, but never really go into detail. So as a curious kid, my whole life, I always was wondering. And I was kind of at the end of my rope when I wrote this book. I was a DJ at a radio station. I was bartending down in on 4th Avenue in Tucson. And I had lost my job as a Tucson Weekly editor. I was just really didn't know what to do with my life. So I wanted to write about something that was more personal to me. And I decided to investigate what Ramon Jauregue did. And they come to find out, he was a World War II veteran. He was an orphan. His mother had died from a stroke. His father died from exposure to mustard gas for being in the army in World War One. So having to talk about always the under represented Mexican migrants and Mexican Americans that fight for this country, having to kind of talk about that with this book, and also talk about his advocacy for the Native Americans in Tucson, the Pascua Yaqui tribe, that were in danger of losing their territory, because the Tucson city of Tucson wanted to build the Interstate 10 through their land, where Oracle Road is, and where we know now the Interstate 10 runs along what used to be a dump. So thankfully, because he helped form La Voz de Mayo, the voice of Mexican American Yaqui and others, they championed to keep the Yaquis there. They helped them get their federal recognition as a tribe, which is hard and nearly impossible to do without treaty rights. And it's all because of someone like my great grandfather, who was a champion for them. And he did so many other things. And it was interesting that he was not recognized in the history books. He wasn't recognized in a lot of the actual Yoeme history libraries or their textbooks. So I didn't want to change history. I wanted to make an addendum to what would happen, because maybe they didn't have access to the documents that I did, because I did have access to their newsletter that they were self-publishing and distributing in trilingual, in English, Spanish, and the Yoeme language, to inform everyone what was happening, as far as what was happening politically, what was happening locally. They also published a lot of poetry and letters to the editor, and was very transparent about what the community was feeling. So after 50 years, I was able to bring that back into print, thanks to Kickstarter, having a lot of people support me, people that I know personally through various walks of life, whether they knew me as a banker, comedian, journalist, radio DJ, pizza delivery guy, or what have you. I was very lucky to have a lot of people support me and have this book published through the third largest native or North American comic book publisher, Image Comics and Top Cow Productions, and have their support and be able to distribute it internationally. And it all could have been possible without, of course, the artist Jay Gonzo, who lives in Phoenix. He is an amazing storyteller, and I'm very grateful he carved 2 years out of his life to help me bring this to fruition.
It's amazing. So what I want to then ask is, you mentioned, the title of this talk is really about your history, your narrative. And something that interests me as someone who writes about comics, who thinks about education, is when you begin a project like this, how do you approach it from both like a narrative standpoint, historical standpoint, and on a practical level, how do you whittle down what is the most essential part that you want to highlight when you do work like this?
Well, I was lucky that I had a background in journalism. So, and one of the things that you don't have in journalism is kind of a finite ending. So there was an ending to the story, and I was able to know what I wanted to get to, which was a very kinetic moment with the La Voz de Mayo group. They organized and had people in trucks and school buses and walk maybe downtown from their reservation, which a lot of people never left their reservation. And it was, going into a whole brand new world, a very concrete jungle to them. And they protest the construction of this interstate, which would have eradicated this community that had one school dedicated to all the children there, which was strategically placed to keep them away from all the other children in the other communities, and have the Native Americans kind of sequestered. So if it weren't for that, I wouldn't have grown up in that community, because it would have been gone. I would have not known the fariseos and the types of celebrations that the Pasco Yaqui are, hold true to their hearts for the last since the 1800s. A lot of their history dates back to the conquest of Mexico with the conquistadors. So learning about that also empowered me to write my new book, Helm Greycastle, which I, going to school in Tucson, Arizona, lovely TUSD, Tucson Unified School District, never really gave me a healthy education on Mesoamerican history, which was, next door. And being, a 30-year-old man learning about, yeah, I know I can recognize Spanish. I can understand it. It's really hard for me to speak it, but I don't feel as bad anymore because my people didn't know Spanish. They knew Nahuatl and other tongues. So not just learning about my personal history with my family, also learning more about myself as a Mexican American person and having, and what Gonzo would always say in our interviews was, we share the blood of the indigenous and the conqueror, which always was really interesting to me. So um but also learning about my great grandfather in a way that a lot, you see, he wasn't really around. He had cheated on my great grandmother, which kind of ostracized him from the family, and that was something I wanted to be a little bit more biased about. I didn't want to, it's always disheartening when I learn something about like my heroes like Gandhi or Martin Luther King, and not really learning about that in school. I feel like learning about their flaws would have made me feel a little better about not being as good as they were. So that was something I included in the book to kind of have some bias or non-bias, so that, and it's when I was writing La Voz de Mayo, it was in the height of the Me Too era. So I think it would have been disingenuous of me to be an ally for women and not talk about the kinds of things that my great grandfather did, and also just trying to learn as a hetero cis, straight male. So um and just working within just in comics and using that medium and being influenced by R. Spiegelman's Mouse. That's what really got me engaged in comics when I was in high school. That was actually the only thing that I really remember or cared about that wasn't punk rock or going to work and being a punk. So I really value that seeing that in classrooms, and I wanted to give back, and not only from that, being inspired by March, John Lewis's graphic novel from Top Shelf, and that really made me believe I can do something that's contextual and about Native Americans, about an underrepresented community, and have a kinetic action, which was that moment when they all protested to stop the freeway from happening. So that was the big inciting moment that I was always trying to build to. And as we were talking about this before with Eddie, I wanted it to be real. Like as soon as you open the page, we're protesting to present day Mexican migrants from being deported and separated from their families, which is going to be an evergreen tweet for as long as I think I'm alive. We're always going to be learning about um, migrants being deported, and no matter what administration, blue or red. And it's something that I'm always going to be talking about or advocating, or really, it doesn't matter who's in office. I will always be kind of putting that in my art. So, yeah, just to answer your question, I just, wanted to make a comic that I've always wanted to see and that I haven't seen. And thankfully, it looks like La Voz de Mayo is inspiring people, which makes me feel old. So, it's an exciting time as far as comics and Latinx folks.
Thank you so much for that. Henry, growing up undocumented and living in severe poverty, I did not have access to TV and cartoons. So my outlet was comic books, which is where I grew up and how I was able to access my world of fantasy and escape the cruel realities of living undocumented. The number one thing that I see is that the very first page and first panels are almost the most impactful, right? When you read those Spider-Man comics, the very first page is what drags you in, what really opens you up. Why did you choose to talk about Rosa and the protest in Tucson and how Rosa was seeking asylum in that church? What drew you to start off with that?
Well, that's where my journey started with my great grandfather. I called him and I said, "Hey, are you busy? There's a protest happening on Cesar Chavez Day," and he was friends with Cesar Chavez. There's a picture with them. They had done an event together that's in the book, and that got him excited, because he had been bad. He had a lot of health problems, and got him all dressed up, and we went down and protested, and that was the beginning, to be honest. And one of the reasons why it was important for me was to kind of show us together doing something that we both believed in, keeping people together. And I wanted him to leave this earth on his 2 feet. Like I wanted him to feel good about his life at the end. I think a lot of our elders don't get to have that last hurrah and kind of just stay home and not really see many people. So it was great to take him to the protest and take him out to eat and just listen to him tell stories and try to kind of let all that sink in so I can tell a story that I think that would respect not only him but the movement and the people that it represents and my city of Tucson that I love. and the state of Arizona, and just it's like an inception dream, just constantly going further and further until you kind of get lost. And that's why it took so long for me to write this book, because I kept discovering new things and coming up with new questions for what every answer that I would get. So um but yeah, the idea was to kind of talk about, this isn't a this is not just a feel good story. This is a story that makes you think, and that it's important to have these kinds of conversations. Like back in 50 years ago, we were talking about the same exact thing: keeping families together, protecting our indigenous folks and our Mexican migrants that do the jobs we don't want to do, or always at that time were being characterized as rapists, murderers, and thieves by by the president who was campaigning at that time. So it was important for me to show and humanize the people that we were trying to rescue.
So you just mentioned Mouse, which is such an interesting book because at its heart, it's a Jewish book, but it's also has this broad appeal beyond the community because it really talks about the human condition. It talks about generation to generation, and I'm just wonder when you first read Mouse, which is Art Spiegelman's. For those who don't know, it's about Art Spiegelman talking to his father about his father's experiences during the Holocaust. What grabbed you about that book? What made you interested, and what made you excited? You said it was about the only thing you remember, reading from back then. So, like, what was
Well,
it
yeah,
that?
I mean, one thing that I remember from high school was having the comic book medium used to educate me. Because yeah, like when you're learning about the Holocaust, it's very, very hard to look at, I think, for as a child. And it's an important thing to look at, because you kind of get a sense of the gravity of what we're dealing with in the world, and why it's so important to um to really cut the root of fascism as soon as you can. Like what we're dealing with now, we're kind of dealing in the same territory where these people, these fascist bigots, have been empowered, and now it's hard to cut this big snake that's just heads keep growing, and it's always going to keep growing. But how do we combat that? And with Art Spiegelman's Mouse, there was a lot of questions it made me ask, like, why are the characters not human? Why, try and remembering, the differences between the dogs and the mice and the cats. And it just was also something. I had only really read Batman, Superman, superhero genre comics, so really challenged me at that age to what the medium was possible for doing. Like I had read Wizard magazine, and I'd always read about books, but I never had those books. I never had access to those books. So it was nice to have that book in my hands and being able to kind of explore a narrative that wasn't black and white, where you don't know if the heroes win at the end. And it was a very interesting, beautiful story. Um, and it really, yeah, like it changed my life. And I'm really grateful that Mr. Johnson in U.S. history was kind enough to include that as curriculum. And I'm really, really honored that, that La Voz de Mayo is kind of following in those footsteps. It's at Cornell College, being implemented hopefully in Austin and Tucson and possibly New York. So um, I'm really, really honored.
Well, Eddie, sorry if you had a question after that, but then I had a quick question just based on that: is why do you think it's because comics are so visual, which makes them so visceral for a lot of people, that makes them a great pedagogical tool? Like you can
Yeah.
see the information. I guess my other question was, do you think, I know that we're in comics, we love comics, but do you think this book could have worked as a prose nonfiction book, or did it have to
Yeah.
be a comic?
It actually started as a prose nonfiction book, because I was a journalist at the time. I was so used to burning through time writing in prose, and that's where I was heading. It was going to be my first prose book too. And uh it would have been, this story lends well in any medium. But what excites me the most is having that as a personally, as having that collaboration with Gonzo and Bernardo Brice and my editor Claire Napier, and talking to, you know, and working through that process was incredible and life changing. And I'm always trying to chase that red dragon and have that feeling again of making La Voz de Mayo. But I'm hoping to do a prose kind of, you know, addendum maybe, or talk about more things that they did that we didn't have time or I didn't have the money to pay for. I did all this out of pocket. So every page I paid for. So it was really important for me to kind of hit the nail on the head when I could.
Thank you. What was the most impactful part or piece of the story of Ramon, of your tata?
I think the most impactful was that moment at the end where they go to the city of Tucson and see, you know, the impact they had, and being able to stop it, and being able to have that bipartisanship that doesn't really exist today. This was, you know, 1971, and it's a different era of politics with Mo Udall and Senator DeConcini, and it's an interesting time then. I think, yeah, I mean, they had their troubles. They had, I think, you know, there's Vietnam going on, and so it's or post Vietnam. So I think that was an important moment, and also the moment of getting the federal recognition, because they had done so much from 1969 to 1976, where they had rebuilt, they had helped the people buy their property for whatever was in their pocket. They had built the El Rio clinics to offer contraceptives and low cost healthcare. They had installed sidewalks and plumbing and electricity in this community that didn't have that. So I feel like that whole span of 6-7 years, that amazing growth, which they still benefit to this day, is an important moment.
How important is representation for you in the comic book genre?
I think it's really important because we've gone so long with a very specific view of that was really kind of available to straight white men. That they also, I think there was a very huge, if it weren't for, I mean, it just, it always kind of stayed the same. And we're lucky to be in a time where there's a lot of people like you and me, Eddie, and AJ, where we grew up on comics, we love comics, but we also are very strong within our convictions of trying to really bring people in the conversation and make it more inclusive for not just people of color, but also non-binary creators. And I think that's an important thing in this time, because and it also lends well to more interesting stories and viewpoints, and it really furthers what we could do with this medium. You know, imagine if there were more women comics creators in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and what kind of stories we would have had, and what kind of stories we would have had if more Black and indigenous and people of color were able to have the type of financial backing that a publisher would offer, you know. And that's why I'm really grateful for Kickstarter, because I don't have to ask for permission. I can, if I have a viable idea, hopefully people resonate with it and are excited about it and like me enough to see me succeed. It's a possibility, and I don't need to pitch it. I don't need to change it. I don't need to I have the creative team that I want, and I think we're in an exciting time, but also we need to figure out a way to value our artists, and that's what I appreciate about the Jewish community. There's a huge, long history of Jewish people supporting their artists. I just learned about Yiddish films recently, where they just started making their own movies for their own people that they thought no one would ever see, and You know, when I had a history with, working with the Jewish Community Center in Tucson, and how accepting and they were of their facilities and their events. So yeah, we're in an interesting time where everyone can make comics, but finding that financial backing and having that financial support is becoming more and more difficult. And I think it's just because of the times we're in. I think we're heading to another financial disaster. A lot of people were out of work for a long time, not making rent, not being able to pay their mortgage. See a lot of I'm forecasting a lot of financial issues in the next 5 to 10 years. So finding that financial stability to tell these stories is going to become more difficult.
Something that you just brought up is it's great that there's more diversity in the marketplace. Like that's always a good thing. I guess the question is, if there are so many people who want to tell their stories, how do you make it possible for them to hear your stories when there's so much going on? There's so much churn, there's so much noise. Like how do you find the right, I don't want to say angle, that's like a kind of like more technical term, but how do you find that hook that this story could resonate with this audience?
That's an interesting question because one of the reasons why my next story, Helm Greycastle, is called Helm Greycastle is because I want it to be as low impact for anyone to enjoy. Because La Voz de Mayo Tata Rambo is not only a mouthful, but you have to pronounce a different language if you're not a Spanish speaking person or reading. So you're saying Mayo, is it Mayo? You're questioning it already when you see the cover of this book. It's also the way I wanted this. The way I pitched this book. It's about my great grandfather who was a World War II veteran, an orphan, and he helped one of the last Native American tribes gain federal recognition. I can talk to somebody on the right about it and really emphasize the American hero, World War II valor, the fighting the government, and also talk to the left about it and talk about how he valued indigenous people and keeping families together, and also growing a conscience outside of fighting for his country. There's so many ways I think I can talk about this story to anybody, and do my best to keep it apolitical when it's a very political comic. And I'm very lucky that I had a life outside of comics. Like I was a banker, I was a DJ, I was working as a comedian, I worked for a jazz festival. So I can take my book and try to find the best way to pitch it to somebody or to sell it to somebody. And I think that's where a lot of people in comics kind of lack. Like you go from college to comics, or you're going from animation to comics. Like you really are skipping maybe some life experience that might help you kind of connect with other people. For me, a big way to break the static, I think you were alluding to, was getting more advocates in the library sector. And librarians, I always say, are going to save this comic book industry because they don't have to sell anybody. They're just trying to get you to read more. So if they know you like Mexican Americans, if they know you like indigenous comics, they're going to point you to La Voz de Mayo because it's something different. There's not a lot like it, if not one of a kind. So I think diversifying where your comic is probably going to help you break the static.
And to anyone who ever, if we ever have another San Diego Comic Con again, one of the best places to hear like the best panels is at the library. It's a little bit of a walk, but it's the best. Some of
There's
the
a
best
really good
content out there.
burrito restaurant next to there, so it's worth the walk to burn all those calories. Yeah, I mean, I'm really grateful that the ALA Graphic Novel Roundtable, they've been helping really curate some amazing things, and I was able to be a part of it a couple of years ago, and sit with David Walker and Candice. There was just like so many great people at that event, and it's free. You don't need a Comic-Con badge to attend. So And you don't need money to attend your library. You just need to get a library card. So if you don't have one now, you can read La Voz de Mayo for free on Hoopla, I think Overdrive, and yeah, so it's a great resource.
Thank you for that. Uh, how important is it for you for like the youth to get involved? Because from what we were noticing is like a lot of our folks on here are younger adults who are really interested in the advocacy. How does it make you feel that like now folks are paying attention to your comic book as a form of inspiration for their advocacy?
I mean, honestly, it's all I've ever wanted, that La Voz to do, having um, somebody somebody picking up La Voz de Mayo and hopefully knowing they can make a difference in this life, and no matter who you are or where you come from, I think that's an important thing, because uh, that means everything to me, and I hope that tradition, that La Voz de Mayo extends that tradition. I think it's very important because I it's very easy to be disenfranchised by what's happening. A lot of the times, like we're sold a promise, within the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, now the Biden administration, that they're going to focus on Mexican migrants, and then they don't. And then they promise that they're going to save our lands from being industrialized and stripped of its resources that are predominantly indigenous, um, promised to indigenous people, and they don't. So, um, it making a book like La Voz de Mayo is a form of counter protest for me. You can do a zine, you could do an Instagram comic, you could do so many different things that can make you feel like you're making a difference, spreading information, inspiring people, that people like yourself are capable of inspiring a change, even if it's really small. So, La Voz de Mayo, yeah, is me writing about my history, about Native American and Mexican American history, and during a very difficult time in my life where I endured the campaigning, the rise, and the victory of Donald Trump as president. So it helps kind of separate you from what's happening and what is possible, and really inspire you to go forward no matter what happens. Like, I think some of the best art is inspired during the worst times. We wouldn't have Art Spiegelman's Mouse, unfortunately, if it weren't for the Holocaust. Like, he was able to tell that amazing story from the incredible grief and sacrifice and survival of his family's history. So, being able to turn what's happening in your life around and make it inspiring for other people, I think is some of the best medicine during these difficult times.
We have a question from the chat from Salma, and she asked, "How does it feel? How does it make you feel knowing that we are fighting the same battle that your grandfather was also fighting?"
Oh, thank you for that question, Selma. And thanks for watching. It makes me feel a lot of things. I'm glad that we're still fighting. It disappoints me that we are fighting, but it's a never ending battle. And I'm glad that there are people that are aware and still carrying the torch in these dark times. And it's going to be people like us that's going to try to inspire change, to raise more money, to help more undocumented people, to inspire more progressive candidates, to keep them to their word, and do our best to help the people around us as much as we can. In the last 2 years, I've been involved with, local protests, whether it be about the mass incarcerations and the mass deportations and the violence against Black folks, and our various gendered um, inequality that's happening. So, doing what you can, and it's an amazing. I think right now we're very lucky to have the resource of the internet and social media to be able to send more information, even though it is a double-edged sword. It's still an interesting time, and I hope, you, Salma, are knowing when to draw your line, and knowing when to take care of yourself, and know when you can fight, and when it's time to kind of step back and not have to carry the world's burdens on your back, and to be able to continue, because we need your voice, and we need your spirit, especially during these rough times.
Thank you so much for that, Henry. Um, where do you see like what's next? I know that like that was on your comic book, and like it's funny that you placed that there for because like that's something I would ask you, and you're asking yourself on the comic, which I thought was really funny. You asked yourself what's next, and I guess I would like to know as well. And then we also have a message from Ellie saying, "What is your biggest message for the youth?"
My biggest message to the youth right now is, it's what you're going through a rough time, something none of us have. We're in a pandemic. We are There's a lot of grief, and there's a lot of dark times ahead of us, especially with our environment. I think it's a huge concern of mine. um, but never give up, and always stand to your you stand by your convictions. It may not align with everybody. You may not always agree with everybody, especially on your own side. It's a really difficult time, I think. And just kind of educating yourself as much as you can, and being more informed, but also knowing that, and when to take care of yourself, and is a really important thing, is another big message I want to tell everyone, because I grew up in an era, and I think AJ and Eddie, we're all kind of the same age, where suicide was really popular in not popular, but real problem within our communities. So just reach out for help when you can. There's always, people around you. If not, my Twitter handle, feel free to send me a message there. These guys know how to get a hold of me. But do everything you can to not give up, and to take care of yourself, and um, do just be as kind and good of a person as you can, as long as you can, because there's going to be days where it's going to be harder than most to be good and positive. So just keep fighting, and don't give up, but also know when to take care of yourself.
It's so
And
great. Yeah.
what was no you had what was next? Yeah, so that was a real conversation I had with my friend Stephanie Bermudez, who's a huge advocate for border startups and entrepreneurship, and someone who I respect and admire a lot. And she asked me, like, what's next? And I was just like, I just finished printing the third issue of this comic, and I'm just like, I felt like the episode in Rick and Morty where they're in the ship crying, and they'd just gone through like 8 days without sleep, which was kind of what happened, because the week after that flew to London to premiere this book. um so what's next? Yeah, I mean, Helm Greycastle is my exciting what's next. That's coming out in April through Image Comics and Top Cow Productions. It's a fantasy, swords and sorcery. But what if the Spanish conquistadors lost the conquest of Mexico, and what if Mexico became a more militaristic, insular world like Wakanda, and these adventurers come in and have to help them kind of liberate themselves from within. So it has a lot of Mesoamerican history, but also kind of a creative license to throw myself in a world that never really existed, because it's now the Mexico that we know now. I'd love to do a graphic novel about Dolores Huerta. I know Scholastic is putting out a graphic novel for, I think, middle school readers for Cesar Chavez. I love Cesar Chavez. He's always been a huge inspiration to me. Um, but I feel like Dolores Huerta needs that kind of recognition, and that kind of that get the March John Lewis treatment before it's too late. I want to do a true crime book. I want to do a superhero book. I want to do a wrestling comic. I want to do, I'm in the middle of doing a Western comic with my friend Chloe, Giroux. I'm very lucky that I have enough ideas to keep me busy for the next 5 to 10 years, and I have a lot of friends that want to see me do well, and they keep buying my books. So I'm a lucky cat.
So interesting you bring up like that middle grade um, market, not just because I mean, to me, that's one of the greatest expansions of the comic book industry right now is that every publisher now wants to focus on that market. Scholastic obviously was doing it a long time ago, but now, like, it seems like every other day, like Random House is doing it, and Penguin's doing it, like all these publishers that didn't care before, now they do care. So I don't know if you would define this book as, I don't think it's for that market specifically, but how would you go ahead, how would you go create a story about like Cesar Chavez or something in a way that is like authentic to who that person was, and kind of you have to show like some of the dark side too, like you have to show the full potential and the full personality of someone and their life. So I mean, just as a writer, as a creative, like what's the line? Where do you want to take something? Where do you not take
Well,
it?
I think it's interesting because like every Disney movie's for kids, right? And like
Mhm.
the inciting moment is when Bambi's mom dies, or when like something horrible that is pretty difficult to any age happens. And being able to treat these middle grade readers with that type of respect, being able to say, hey, this death is in this book, and this is something that you need to ingest to get the gravity of this story. So I feel like when you're writing for an audience, you really have to write for yourself, and being able to ask these difficult questions and incite these difficult feelings that makes people connect with your story. Um, I would really like to do a Dolores Huerta, a graphic novel in the same lane as March, in a way that I'm really not writing for an age group. I'm really writing for the truth, and trying to get this person's story down while they're still alive before it's too late. She's in her 90s. I'm really kind of scared that I won't get to talk to her before I get to write this book. So that would be a huge, huge disappointment for me, but that wouldn't stop me from writing the story. But, and to your point, AJ, the comic book industry did a really horrible job targeting young readers. And now we're making up for that, because that just expands this industry for another 50 to 100 years.
Yeah, definitely. And like to just piggyback off of that, because myself and AJ also did a little webcast on March on John Lewis, and something that we really resonated with was the rawness of it. Like the comic book did not hold back, right? Like it did not hold back the very brutality of what they were trying to talk about, and that's actually something that I really enjoyed off of your book as well. Like you did not hold back on the rawness. I mean, you started off with the protest, and the cruel reality is that like we're still living it, right? um I just really was blown away by that like you do not hold back, and it it really brings in a grounding sensation that comic books aren't just a place for us to escape but also acknowledge what's happened.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you caught that. I'm glad that resonates with people. I hope that keeps people's attention when they open that book, because it's an important thing. I think that will happen forever, and we'll always be talking about, unfortunately. Um, so that was the goal, was to kind of follow those March footsteps and talk about difficult things like deportations, police violence, racism within the indigenous community, the drug issues that the indigenous, and alcohol issues that the indigenous communities are still enduring, and a lot of communities are. And having those, and I think that's something we all can recognize in our day-to-day lives, unfortunately, within family members and within, probably, in your own home.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
well, go ahead, AJ.
No, Henry, this was, I feel it's it's always great to come together to talk about our histories and our stories, our narrative, because that is our truth. And without central truths, we really don't have a reason to move forward with life. Um, I feel like what has happened in the past, you know, influences how we think about the future, how we think about right now. And so having these stories recorded, is really important, not just for us as consumers of media, but also for that generation that comes, after us and then after them. Going back to Mouse, when that was published in the 80s, it was so stark. Now it's kind of, I wouldn't say normalized, but it's like people recognize it. They recognize that book because they recognize that these stories are important so that we don't forget what happened in the past. And but without those stories, we don't have anything else to kind of go forward with. So, I just wanted to say thank you so much for writing this book, because it's an important one. I think it's a foundational one for this part of for the comics reading public. It's going to be, a foundation stone for this type of comic. So I don't know. I was just inspired by
Thank
this
you.
book. Yeah, by this talk too.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't
Yeah.
usually get this deep. We talk about the Ramones and what we're
Yeah.
gonna have for dinner that night. So
Yeah.
it's good to kind of get a little bit more substantial with our conversations, AJ. I've been meaning to talk to you about that.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
Well, thank you so much, everybody who's on this call. Huge thank you
Yeah.
to Henry. We appreciate you. I don't know if the biggest impact of this was your advocacy, but it sure is hitting for a lot of us, and for a lot of us who grew up like seeking representation, seeking to see this. This is just illuminating for us. For a lot of us in the movement, I know a lot of us on this call. Recently, as recent as this Friday, we were able to support some asylum seekers, and we literally saw kids in shackles as they were getting released from ICE.
That's
Like
incredible. Thank you
this is
for
the
all the
type,
work you're doing, everyone.
thank you. This is the type of advocacy that like in your books that really just like energizes us. That energizes us to continue the work. So we highly appreciate you, and we look forward for more comics, man. So I'm so glad that you got a busy schedule up because we're awaiting. So I appreciate you, Henry.
Thank you so much for
Yeah.
having
Thank
me.
you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for watching.
Take care, y'all.